and welcome to another show of historical fiction coming soon. And today I'm excited to introduce you all to, but I'm sure you all know her already, amazing superstar Jennifer Robson.
Hello, everyone.
And she's going to chat with us and read to us and, just go on like we do. I'll read Jennifer's bio first, and then I'll read a little bit about her new upcoming book, which will be out when? When is it coming?
January 5th, which is actually my birthday. I turned 51. And so what better way to celebrate moving fully into that decade than with a new book, I figure.
So we should all pre-order for your birthday. That's a birthday
Yes, it'd be a wonderful birthday present for me. I'd be very grateful.
That's the plan. All right. So, and it's called Our Darkest Night. So
yeah,
and it's a gorgeous cover. I love it.
Once again, I just the team at William Morrow, and it's Mumtaz Mustafa is the cover designer, and she's done most of my covers, and she's so talented. And this is, actually at the closer up view, although of course I wonder if you guys are seeing it backwards as I am on the screen, but good. I just love it. I love it, and it just encapsulates the book to me, and it really does look like that part of Italy. It's very familiar to me. So here we are.
I want to read it even more. All right, back to business. I'm going to read the bio first. An academic by background, a former editor by profession, and a lifelong self-proclaimed history nerd, Jennifer Robson, the author of 6 novels set during and after the 2 world wars, Somewhere in France, After the War is Over, Moonlight over Paris, Goodnight from London, The Gown, and the forthcoming Our Darkest Night, a novel of Italy and the Second World War. She was also a contributor to the acclaimed anthology Fall of Poppy, Stories of Love and the Great War. That's another beautiful book. Jennifer studied French literature and modern history as an undergraduate at King's University College at Western University, then attended St. Antony's College at the University of Oxford, where she obtained her doctorate in British economic and social history. While at Oxford, Jennifer was a Commonwealth Scholar and an SSHRC doctoral fellow. Jennifer lives in Toronto with her husband and children and shares her home office with Ellie the sheepdog and her feline companions Sam and Nika. Are they going to make an appearance?
So there might be, because the window here, this is where my cat really loves, this is Sammy, really loves to sit and chirp at the birds, because we have cardinals who come to the back, who I feel are like, by extension, pets, really. I became obsessed with them, in quarantine. And so those cardinals feast on the finest of birdseed mixes. I have to say, and I'm obsessed with making sure their feeders there. We get a bunch of chickadees. So he likes to sit on this windowsill and you know how cats do he talks to them. But if there is barking, that's because once again, a very, very, very bad man has come up the steps to the front of our house and left something dangerous on the porch.
That's a good guard dog. Well, mine is he just wandered in. He needs his nails clipped. He's just tick.
Yeah. We call those the tippy tappies. And I feel as if my husband will do and it's an ordeal getting her to settle down and have her nail. She's not a huge dog, but she's pretty strong. Mm-hmm. And so he has to kind of lie on top of her on the floor to do and he'll do that. And I feel like 2 days later, I hear a clicky, clicky, clicky.
I know, you just can't keep up. Yeah, well, Murphy doesn't like me to do it anyway, so I just put it off and put it off. He waits us at 3 a.m. Anyway, okay, we could talk all day.
Yeah, I know. Talk about the animals.
All right, Our Darkest Night, a novel of Italy and the Second World War. It is the autumn of 1943, and life is becoming increasingly perilous for Italian Jews like the Mazin family. Mazin.
But the only reason I know how to pronounce these things is because my husband is Italian Canadian, and he corrects me whenever I'm wrong, and I'm wrong almost all the time. My comprehension of Italian is nothing like it should be.
With Nazi Germany now occupying most of her beloved homeland and the threat of imprisonment and deportation growing ever more certain, Nina Mazin has but one hope to survive. She must leave Venice and her beloved parents and hide in the countryside with a man she has only just met. Niccolò Gerardi was studying for the priesthood until a wartime tragedy forced him to leave the seminary to run his family's farm. A moral and just man, he refuses to remain a bystander to Nazi and fascist atrocities. Rather than allow Nina to risk a perilous escape across the mountains, he offers her shelter. To keep her safe and protect secrets of his own, however, Nina and Nico must convince everyone, including his own family, that they are happily married and in love. But farm life is not easy for a cultured city girl who dreams of becoming a doctor like her father, and Nico's provincial neighbors are wary of this soft and educated stranger in their midst. Even worse, their distrust is shared by a local Nazi official with a vendetta against Nico. The more he learns of Nina, the more his suspicions grow, and with them, his determination to exact revenge. As Nina and Nico come to know each other, their feelings deepen, transforming their relationship into much more than a charade. Yet both fear that every passing day brings them closer to being torn apart. Beautiful.
Yeah. It's and it's there, you might want to have a tissue or two nearby to dab at your eyes. What's like and I've talked about this with writer friends, Kate Quinn among them. Hi Kate, if you're watching this. You haven't really done your job if you haven't made someone cry at least once when they're reading your books.
That hashtag sorry not sorry.
Sorry, totally not sorry. Totally not sorry. I mean, what I will promise though is for all that they Nina has a tough time. I am not going to ruin your day. I don't want to say any more than that, but I'm not going to ruin your day. You're not going to hate me, I hope, when you finish this book. It's not, I'm not going to do that. So that's not the plan. Yeah.
Well, would you like to read chapter 1?
I will read chapter 1 from Our Darkest Night. And this is the first time I've read it out loud. So we'll see. I may be tripping over my words and mispronouncing everything in Italian. My husband will watch it later and say, "Oh, Jen, really?"
Perfect.
28th October, 1942. It was long past time to be heading home. With the help of Sandro, the nicest of the porters at the Casa di Riposo, Antonina had managed to get her mother into a chair, the one by the window, the comfortable one they'd brought from home, and she'd pass the time by brushing Mama's hair and describing what she could see in the piazza below. She knew her mother could hear and understand, for didn't she turn to the sound of Antonina's voice when she arrived for a visit? Didn't she hold tight with her good hand and squeeze her fingers when her daughter whispered that she loved her? Papa was the best doctor in Venice besides, and he was sure that Mama could understand them. All the more important, then, to spend as many hours as she could at her bedside. But the campanile at San Geremia had just chimed 5, and Papa would be waiting at home, and it wasn't safe to be out alone after dark, not anymore. I have to go home and help Marta with supper, and if I'm not there to remind him to eat, you know that Papa will keep on reading until he falls asleep at his desk. Shall I help you back to bed, or would you like to stay here until they bring your supper? Mama nodded, the movement so fleeting anyone else would have missed it, and when Antonina bent to kiss her cheek, she closed her eyes and lifted her face, still unlined, still so pretty, to the last of the sun. I'll be back in the morning. Try to eat up your supper when they bring it, will you? Her journey home took her across the still busy piazza, through the gloom of the Sottoportico di Ghetto Novo, and up and down the steps of the bridge. Then a quick turn into a narrowing and darking cala, then another, and finally, perched at the edge of the murky waters of the Rio del Ghetto, the slender afterthought of their house, its facade a patchwork of crumbling ochre stucco and rosy brick. The number had faded away long ago, but they'd never felt the need to repaint it. Everyone knew to knock on the green door for Dr. Mazin, and he would come, no matter the hour. Up the stairs she ran, her shoes squeaking on the freshly mopped landing, and along the hall to her father's study. But the sound of voices within stopped her short. He might be speaking with a patient or writing down something important, and since she'd been old enough to talk, she'd know never to barge in. She knocked twice and waited for the voices to still. Papa? Come in, came the reply, and she opened the door to discover her father was not at his desk, but at the table by the window, and next to him was one of his oldest friends. Father Bernardi! Oh, Papa didn't tell me you were visiting. It's been months and months. He stood, a little creakily, and shook her hand. I know, my dear, and I'm sorry for it. Your father was telling me that you were visiting your mother. How is she? Oh, the same as ever, I suppose. But happy? At least I hope she is. And you? Oh, I'm well enough, weary of travel and longing for my own bed, but that's the worst of it. I'm glad to hear it. Hasn't Marta brought you anything? She asked dutifully, though she doubted they had anything worth sharing with guests. I only arrived a few minutes ago, and you know how your father and I are when we get talking. But wait a moment, I have something for you. He reached for the overcoat he'd slung over the back of his chair, pulling it across his lap until he could rummage in its pockets, and after a few moments held up a small packet wrapped in newspaper. An impossibly delicious scent filled the air. From friends who lived abroad, he explained. Coffee! Oh, Father Bernardi, you're so kind. Let me dig out our cafetiera. I won't be long. She was standing in a chair, searching through the top shelves of the pantry cupboard when Marta reappeared. What are you doing up there? Looking for the coffee maker. Father Bernardi is visiting. We haven't had coffee since his last visit. That was months ago. Marta sighed. Typical of her size. It was drawn out, mournful, and vibrating with resentment. It will get people talking. The Catholic priest of all people coming to visit. How your father even knows the man. He's been a patient of Papa's for years and years, and his friend too. And Papa always has people coming and going. I doubt anyone will care. Her protest was a formality, for Father Bernardi's visit would certainly be noted and remarked upon by everyone they knew. Had they lived anywhere else, no one would have cared. But the ghetto was a close-knit place, the sort of neighborhood where people love nothing better than burrowing into each other's business. And so her father's agnostic leanings, as well as his avowed determination to be guided by science rather than faith, had long been a focus of local gossip. Her fingers closed around the worn aluminum of the cafetiera, dusty from disuse, and she pulled it from its hiding place. Where's the grinder? Oh, in the next cupboard over. Do we have any sugar for the coffee? A little. I mean, if your father had bothered to tell me he was expecting someone, I'd have made my zaiti. He really only has himself to blame, Marta grumbled. Well, delicious as the zaiti were, Marta couldn't possibly have made the cookies. There was hardly any flour in the pantry, no raisins, barely enough sugar to sweeten the coffee, and they hadn't seen a fresh egg in months. But pointing it out would only lead to more sighs. Instead, Antonina washed out the pot and set about grinding the barest handful of beans, so precious and rare they might as well have been gilded. There was just enough in the little drawer of the grinder, once she'd chased out every clinging speck, to make 2 small cups of coffee, hardly more than a mouthful each. She'd reused the grounds for herself and Marta, for even watered-down coffee tasted better than the caffè d'orzo, made of roasted barley that some told themselves was as good as the real thing. It was enough, for now, to smell the coffee as it brewed. As she divided it between the prettily decorated porcelain cups her parents had bought in Florence on their honeymoon, as she set them and the sugar bowl in a tray and hurried back to her father's study. The smell was the best thing about coffee, anyway, and it was only so tantalizing because she was hungry. Once she'd had her supper, she wouldn't notice it as much. The men were so intent on their conversation they didn't look up when she entered, and it would never do to interrupt. So she went about sugaring the coffee, setting the cups at their elbows, and taking her seat at a twin of her mother's chair at the casa. Her father spared her a smile, and he drank down his coffee appreciatively, but his attention remained fixed on his friend. This city, these few islands, are the nearest thing we Jews have to a promised land in Europe. We have lived here, unmolested for centuries, yet you suggest that we abandon it? And for what? Her father asked, his voice rising. The dubious welcome the Spanish might offer us? A panic trek through the mountains before the Swiss send us back? If you had listened to me when they first barred you from your work, from your profession. I belong nowhere else. I'm as Italian as you. I was born here. I have no other home. What would become of me, of my family, of my patients? And the fascists have made no move against us beyond the racial laws. You speak of those laws as if they're something one might expect within the bounds of normal civil society, but they stripped you and every Jew I know of his profession. No, don't frown at me like that. Look at what they did to dear Dr. Jonah. The man is well into his 70s, had retired years ago, yet still they removed his name from the register of physicians. His professorship at the university gone, too. All he has left is his presidency of your Jewish community here, and that's hardly more than a formality. The laws are noxious. On that, my dear Giulio, we agree. But I've found a way to exist, just as we've always done. Her father leaned forward, his hands clasped so tightly his fingertips had gone white, and his voice faded to whisper. I've heard that defeat at El Alamein is all but certain. Surely the tide must be turning. Well, that may well be, but it's turning far too slowly for my liking. And in the meantime, Il Duce grows more desperate. The Germans grow ever bolder, and we wait for the axe to fall. And it will fall, for it's only a matter of time before they seize power here, just as they did with Austria, with the rest of Europe for that matter. And what then? Father Bernardi asked, his affable voice sharpening into solemnity. Only think, what if they were in power here? What would prevent them from rounding you up just as they're doing with the Jews of Germany, of Poland, of France? And if I were to leave with Antonina, make the journey to Switzerland, what would become of my Devora? She cannot travel, you know that. And you know I will not leave her. Not as long as there is breath in my body. Bad enough that she must live in the rest home. Her father wrenched off his spectacles and set about polishing them with a crumpled handkerchief, and from the way he pressed his lips together and pinched at the bridge of his nose, Antonina could tell he was fighting off tears, just as he always did when he spoke of her mother, the stroke that had left her so weakened, and the agonizing decision to move her to the rest home earlier that year. It was a good thing, she decided, that she hadn't allowed herself any of the coffee, for even the idea of abandoning her mother was enough to tighten her throat and turn her empty stomach upside down. Her father was quick to notice her distress. Oh, don't look so alarmed. We're safe enough here, aren't we? He asked Father Bernardi, and it seemed to Antonina that his eyes, as he looked to his friend, held a warning of some kind. But was it to be truthful or to be kind? The priest nodded, but his gentle smile didn't convince her. For the moment, yes, the priest said, but do not forget what we... I won't, her father interrupted. I promise I won't forget. Well then, I ought to be on my way. I'd only meant to stop by for a minute or two. Father Bernardi stood, took a moment to find his balance, and then shook hands with her father. Thank you for your hospitality. Turning to Antonina, he grasped her outstretched hand in both of his. I shall pray for your mother, my dear. Thank you, Father Bernardi. I wish you safe travels. While her father said goodbye to his friend, she busied herself with collecting the coffee cups and tray and returning them to the kitchen. Rather than leave the cups to Marta, who had broken all but 3 of the set over the years, she painstakingly washed and dried and put them away. Only after the other woman, still grumbling about the annoyance and inconvenience of the priest's visit, had begun to prepare their supper, did Antonina return to the study. Her father was sitting in the chair he had occupied earlier, and he now beckoned her forward. Come and sit with me. Were you happy to see Father Bernardi again? Oh, of course. I was happy to see him, but, well, things are difficult, as you know. He risks a great deal in coming here. You were upset earlier when I came in with the coffee. I was, but not with him. You know we've always relished a lively discussion, but I do regret. What is it? She pressed, and it was impossible to keep the fear from her voice. He reached out to grasp her hand, as if he needed the reassurance of her presence. I meant what I said earlier about belonging nowhere else. And I can bear it, you know, these slights, these difficulties, so long as I may call myself a Venetian, an Italian. but I do regret that your life has become so confined. I had hoped once that you might go to university. You, she began, but the words caught in her throat, choking her. She swallowed hard, waited a moment, and tried again. You never said. I never knew that you had wanted such a thing for me. She'd been working her way through his textbooks for years, careful never to let him know, and not because she thought he disapproved. He'd always been so proud of her, and once he'd loved nothing more than to discuss her lessons and help with her homework, with her schoolwork. But the racial laws of 1938 had expelled her and every other Jewish student in Italy from school, and when her father had told her of it, he had broken down and wept, and it was the first time Antonina had ever seen him cry. So she had decided that it would be far kinder to simply borrow his books and memorize as much as she could, and then, one day, when she was allowed to go to school again, she would be ready. Of course I did. I still do. A bright girl like you belongs in university, not spending your days in the rest home or queuing up for bread or oil, or the war won't last forever. I might still go to school once it ends. Well, you might, he admitted, or perhaps I might teach you some of what I know, as if you were one of my students in Padua. I don't miss those long hours in the train on my teaching days, but I do miss my students, and I think you would make a very good doctor. Do you think? Oh, I would love nothing more, she promised, blinking hard. It was silly to cry over something that was good. We'll be constrained by our circumstances. It will be far from a comprehensive education, but I can give you an idea, if nothing more, of what medicine is like, if it's something that suits you. When can we start? Well, I know you've been reading through my library for years, so I suspect you're well on your way. You noticed? She asked, though she ought not to have been surprised. It wasn't as if she had hidden what she was doing. Oh, of course I did. And perhaps I ought to have said something, encouraged you in your studies. Still, books can only teach you so much. You'll learn more by coming with me on some of my visits. I'll ask permission, of course, but I think most of my patients will be content to have you present, and it will be helpful to have an extra pair of hands. So I will watch as you work? Yes. You will watch, and in time you will learn how to see. You will listen, and then you will learn how to hear. And that, my darling girl, is how a doctor is made. There, that's the end of the first chapter. So we've only just met Antonina and her father and Father Bernardi and
Marta.
And it sets the stage. Yeah.
Don't forget Marta. I enjoy characters like
Marta. That. Yes. Yeah. Marta is anyone. Let's just say my Italian family was familiar with, the Marta who has a heart of gold. She really does. And she's not a major fixture in the book, but certainly, there's no reason you can't have a good, you can't complain when you're annoyed about things.
Exactly. I always love a character like that. Just on the side, just for a little comedic.
Yeah. She's just she's, you need a moment or two of levity amidst the gloom. And I don't want anyone to think that for all that it's set at a very dark time in human history, but it's not a gloomy book. And there are fun moments and happy moments. There are moments of joy all throughout the book, as there were in real life. That's how people kept on keeping on, right? And I think that's a notion that's familiar to a lot of people right now. It's find joy wherever you come across it, and try and make the most of it.
Sometimes those are the hard parts to find, though, when you're writing about something that dark.
Yeah. And it's with this book too, it's a case of being true to the history, and at no point minimizing the very real, very kind of calamitous suffering of of those who were caught up in the Holocaust. It just on many levels that horrifies me. The idea of ever minimizing it or turning it into a thing of entertainment. But at the same time, what I was very conscious of when I was writing this was not wanting to um, uh, fetishize the violence and the trauma in a way that would be disrespectful to those who both perished and survived. And it's a really fine line to walk. And I'm hopeful that I've managed to walk that line so that and also I want the book to inform people, to transport them in a certain way, but not to kind of lay a blanket of horror upon them so that you yourself as the reader feel traumatized. I think that actually does a disservice to the history, to the memory of the people who are caught up in this.
It is a tough line though between being, you don't want to pull punches, right? It needs to be true to itself, but you don't want to be gratuitous. So there's that
and I think for me it was focusing on the emotional weight of what happened as opposed to dwelling on details. And that to me, like I just think I just really wanted to avoid any gratuitous discussion of moments of violence or anything that would be triggering for people also. But what I do delve into is kind of the emotional cost of what happens to the characters. I'm skirting around this a little bit because I don't want to give too much of the book away. And I don't want anyone to go into reading it thinking that it's a downer book. It's not. I wrote this book. I had mostly finished writing it at the beginning of 2020. And in fact, I had kind of a very rough first draft that I turned in to my editor on January 1st. And then I got on a plane and went to Italy with my husband.
Days, huh?
Oh, I mean, we traveled. Oh my gosh. Because what I wanted to do before, and I hadn't been able to go earlier in the year because I had so many speaking engagements and I was just caught up with stuff with my kids and just finding that 10 days was tricky, but we found it at the beginning of January, just coming up a year ago. And we retrace the steps of my characters. So wherever Antonina goes in the book, I went there. And in some cases, it was a return. I mean, I've been to Venice. I've spent a lot of time in northern Italy with my husband's family, but I wanted to make sure that what I was describing in the book was as true to what I felt. Nina herself would have seen. And so, that happened. And then I came home and I wrote the second draft, and then just the world kind of tipped over. And so as I was polishing the book and doing the final scenes and, writing, rewriting, you're familiar with this, that, it's not done until it's torn out of my hands kind of, I just felt this, I felt that I was trying to infuse the book with a sense of hope. And I think that's one of the reasons that so many of us like reading about the Second World War, especially now. And for that matter, even the First World War, but the Second World War in particular, because there's such a kind of, it's rare that history offers us any clarity, right? And I'm not saying there's clarity to every aspect of reading about or studying the Second World War. But there is a sort of, a clarity in terms of looking back and seeing what people were up against and the scope of the evil that they were that they were trying to overcome,
Mhm.
and they did, imperfectly. Certainly fascism was not dead at the end of World War II, unfortunately, nor was anti-Semitism, or any of the terrible, terrible schisms that still kind of cleave nations apart. Those are still there, but it's fascinating to see how people kind of can have a moments of unity where they come together, and with a kind of a singular purpose, and what we can do.
Mhm.
And time and again this year, I've been reminded of that as I watch the news and I see the moments where we're working together really beautifully, and also where we're not working together so well. And I think to myself, um, it just like it's things like, just okay. This is me being a history nerd, but things like the Blitz in London,
Mhm.
which is by no means the only example of people working together and civilians really shouldering a heavy burden, and but it's actually a pretty well known one, so it's an easy one to you know kind of bounce, play around with ideas of kind of comparing periods in history. And if the people affected by the Blitz, not just Londoners, but if the people across Britain affected by the Blitz conditions from September 1940 to roughly May 1941. What if people decided, you know what? No, I just don't feel like shutting the curtains tonight. I just don't feel like it. Yeah. And you know what? I was up all last night because of the bombing. I just don't feel like going into work tomorrow. Yeah. I mean, I just don't. I don't feel up to it. You're like, that's not something we associate with that time. What we remember is that the vast majority of people did do what they were asked to do. They did, obey the blackout laws. And it's people have argued, like, would it have made a difference? Who knows? But they were working with the best information they had at the time, which was to black the cities out, was to make them as dark as possible, was helpful, and people by and large complied, and were very vigilant in letting their neighbors know, oh, I can see light coming from your window, and the same thing with rationing. Like, most people complied, in part because you know they didn't have a lot of choice. Yes, there were black markets for everything, but you had to have money to pay for the black market goods, and
Mhm.
most people just didn't have extra cash lying around at the best of times. So most people conformed, right? And that meant, like, the by rationing civilian foodstuffs and materials, it meant that Britain, could keep kind of staggering along, because it was a nation under siege. So all of these things, as I'm sitting and watching people, uh, act in a fashion at times that is less than sensible and runs contrary to what our public health officials are telling us to do. And I want to say, oh, I think
That's a
I
great
think
parallel.
your grandparents, or great grandparents, as it were, if they, having lived through the war, might have had something to say about that.
Mhm.
Um, because it's not an unthinking compliance, right?
Yeah. That's
Anyhow, this is me on my little soapbox, and
no, but that's a great parallel. And it's
yeah,
great. I mean,
yeah,
and that's part of why we do remember the Blitz, right? Is because of the resilience of the human spirit, and to work with each
yeah,
other towards a noble cause,
yeah.
and to
Well, it's like week after week after week, people were bombed every night. Like, the bombs were falling every night. You were in a bomb shelter, or huddled in the cellar or under the stairs, or in a horrible leaky shelter in your garden. Because
you know,
the water table being quite high in England, and so people were sitting in, like, little puddles under the ground in their shelters. Um,
we have
eh,
it pretty good
well,
these days.
that's and so they'd be bombed all night, and kind of you'd be lucky, you'd consider yourself lucky to have survived. Some nights it was so bad. And then you had to get up the next morning and go to work. People were going to work. And there was no, there's no mass absenteeism. Maybe if it had been your house that had fallen down, you might, kind of take a little bit of time off to retrieve what's left of your belongings. And so that's just, as I'm sitting feeling a little bit like, oh, I can't go into the store to buy the whatever. It's
Yeah.
First of all, and I say this as somebody who, first of all, there are people who are really struggling, frontline health workers, people with small businesses. I absolutely, like I am, but those of us who don't actually have a lot of, how should I put it, a lot of worries like out there right now, I think it's worth looking back and saying, you know what, all things considered, it's not bad. It's not bad. I'm not sitting in a hole in my garden with a corrugated tin roof in a puddle of water every night as bombs are dropped on Toronto, right? That's not happening.
Yeah, I think that's a lot of why people are reading so much historical fiction right now, because I think there's more and more of a passion for history right now.
Yeah.
Just reminding them that we're doing okay and we've survived that. We can survive pretty much anything.
Yeah. Well, it was eye-opening for me when I did the research into this book, which is, again, it's a departure for me. I've never written anything set outside England or France before. But I wanted to explore the story we discovered really by chance from one of my husband's aunts who's very elderly now. And it wasn't a secret. It was just one of these things. And this is typical of anyone with relatives who lived through the war. Things aren't necessarily secrets. It's just that they've never talked about them, right? They wouldn't necessarily lie about it. They wouldn't say, no, that never happened. You just have to ask the right questions. And sometimes you'll be very surprised what they say. And we just discovered by chance in a conversation with her that she remembered her father having sheltered strangers in the house, like people, and then we pressed her more, and then she said, well, we were like, who are these people during the war? And they were Italians, Jewish Italians, who had to go into hiding. Otherwise, they would have been deported. And it was the local priest who went round. And this is a little village in the north of Italy called San Zenone delle Ezzelini. And it's more of a town now, but it would be closer to a village at the time. And Father Stocco, the parish priest, came round very quietly to a number of the parish families and just said, would you be willing to hide people? And he was not pressed to do this by anyone else. This was his own undertaking. And where he'd hear of people who had to flee, and he would promise to hide them. And so my husband's grandparents were approached and said yes, they would hide people. And so over the course of, I think probably the last 2.5 years of the war, they hid, we think it was a minimum of 3 different groups of people. Again, because the last surviving sibling kind of who would have memories of that time, because my mother-in-law has passed away and her oldest sister has passed away. It's this one aunt who was still a very little girl at the time, and so has kind of imperfect memories. And I remember thinking, well, it's an amazing story, and man, I love if it were true. And not that I disbelieved her, but memories you can get a little tangled over the years. But then when I did kind of go and search approach Yad Vashem, which has an incredible database with just tons of information about the people who have been named righteous among the nations, I just thought, well, maybe there's a chance. And the priest is Father Odostoko is there. He's named as righteous among the nations for the work he did in San Zenone, hiding people. And we believe my husband's grandparents were among those who helped to hide fellow Italians for the most part. Some people might have been from elsewhere in Europe, but for the most part, they were Italian. And because we knew so little of the details of what had happened with my husband's grandparents and the people that stayed with them, I didn't feel I could even begin to tell that story. And I didn't even feel that it was my story to tell. I just, that didn't feel right to me to appropriate those details. But it was a starting point for me to ask, because, and that's how I'm sure you do the same thing. Like, there's a moment where you ask yourself, what if? What if, and then you start spinning the story in your head. And to me, it was a moment of, well, what if I told a story from the point of view of one of the people who had to hide? And what would that be like to have grown up? Like she's Italian. Her family has lived in Italy for hundreds and hundreds of years. They are fully Italian. This is the only language that she really speaks. This is her, and her identity is bound up in being Italian as much as it is in being Jewish. And to suddenly be told you don't belong, you're not wanted.
Yeah.
You know, they've always been good citizens. They paid their taxes. They obeyed the laws. Her father, is this eminent physician, and suddenly they're told, no, we don't want you. And this didn't start with the Nazis occupying Italy in 1943. This had started well before. And so that's what I want. I wanted to know, what was it like? And what was fascinating to me, and I'm kind of circling around to the point I was starting to make, is that when I started digging in, talking to my husband's aunts and uncles, people who were alive at the time, interviewing people in San Zenone, and the kind of around the region just to the north where the book is set. It gave me a really belated understanding of of the circumstances that in which my husband's parents, grew up, and they were not terribly poor as far as people kind of the laboring classes in Italy. I mean, they were certainly at the top end of that scale in terms of they owned their own farm, and they had their own land, which is a very rare thing. But they often went without food. I mean, they had to be they had so little. Materially, they had very little. And anything they ate, it was the product of labor on their part that had so little in the way of time saving and labor saving conveniences. It's just astonishing. And so I wanted to capture the amount of work that these women had to do, the women specifically in the family had to do. Just an ordinary day in the life of Rosa, the sister-in-law that we meet, is up at dawn and unceasing labor until she falls into bed and then gets up again about 5 hours later. And that was typical of my husband's grandparents and all of the family. And I wanted to kind of honor that by talking about it honestly. And again, it shames me that, like, I'll whine about having to do the laundry, for example. Who doesn't? Oh man, I've got the mountains of laundry from the kids' rooms. All I'm doing is shoving the laundry into a machine, right? And folding it afterwards, which is nothing. There's a extended scene in the book where I describe what it took to wash the clothes. And because my mother-in-law, when she was still alive, I did talk about this with her, and she, they had running water, but to kind of rinse mountains of laundry, the best way to do it was in the nearby stream. And these are glacier-fed streams. So after you've rinsed your first sheet like that, you stop. Your hands might as well be made out of ice. And so she always blamed rinsing the sheets in the mountain stream for why she had terrible arthritis later on. And It makes sense to me.
Yeah, it does. It's amazing to
Yeah.
look back and see how much they did and how much we should really stop complaining about, because it
Yeah.
really is.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, whenever, and my kids, I'm terrible with them, when they're complaining about having to do chores and stuff, I'm like, well, if your Nona were still alive, they could tell you about how they had to work in the fields, starting when they were about 4 years old. Right?
Exactly.
Because as
Yeah.
soon as you're old enough to tell the difference between one plant and another and can be told, okay, this plant leave, this other one pull out, then you're old enough to work in the fields,
Yes.
which
My
happened.
my husband's grandfather came from Poland in 1928, and we've actually traced him through Pier 21 and everything. And
Wow.
you think about how he came across. He actually went all the way across to Saskatchewan in 1928 and cleared land with. He didn't have an ox, so he just cleared it all by land and all that scrub brush. And you think, wow, now we complain about having to shovel snow, and it
Yeah.
really takes you back
Yeah. Yeah.
to
Yeah.
reality.
Well, and my late parents-in-law, like they worked. Like that's what they knew was to work. So even once they were retired, their days were, I mean, slotting in visits, right? Because they had a routine. Their vegetable garden was a thing of beauty. It was, I mean,
I bet.
we ate so well. We never had to go to the market or anything. We just had mountains of produce all summer. And that was just, and winters were tough for them because there's a limit to the work they could do. They weren't the kind of people to just sit around. And I just hope, if there, I've one regret is that I'm coming to write this book after they're both gone,
Right.
and I can't share it with them. But it is being translated simultaneously into Italian, so all of my family in
Oh,
Italy will be able to read it
I
and
think
on kind of in January, along with the English version. So that's
perfect.
exciting.
How many languages, is it going to be?
So far, yeah, I keep getting emails about the languages that are getting picked up. I believe it's gone into Russian most recently, and those typically will take longer. The Italian one is it's HarperCollins Italia, so they were able to get started on the
Oh,
translation quite a bit faster.
excellent.
But it's exciting to know
Yes,
it'll be there, and they'll
that's
be able to read about
that's
you
a
know
wonderful tribute, and
yeah,
they'll all
yeah,
recognize it. Good for you, and it's always so great when you can bring it back to family. And
yeah.
well, this has been great. Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
I
Thank
learned
you. I feel
so much.
like we could talk about
I know.
natter about history. We should just do another one. It's like,
Yeah.
Jen and Jen talk about history.
Oh,
Just throw the questions at us,
that
right?
sounds really good. We could do that
Yeah.
sometime.
I know. And I mean, it's like, you know what it is? It's the secret. It's the wannabe university professor who, I never ended up holding a teaching position. I just could never find a teaching job.
But you do the
And
opposite.
but this is, I get to do all the fun parts without all the hard parts like marking or sitting on committees.
You see, you're the opposite for me because I slept through history class. I could not care less until about a
Mm,
decade ago. So
yeah.
it'd be even more interesting to
Yeah.
talk that we
Well,
could.
I didn't have a choice because it was compulsory around the dinner table, right? My dad was a history professor, and my mom, was a lawyer and later a judge, but she could easily have taught history herself. She was very knowledgeable and passionate about Canadian history. And so I just, I feel as if, and my kids are both taking history in school right now and they're loving it. I'm just like, oh,
Oh, that's so neat.
something stuck. All the stuff I've been throwing at them and it seems to have stuck.
That sounds great. Good for you on all fronts.
Thank
And
you. Thank
and
you.
and now we're all going to pre-order for your birthday.
Thank
Definitely.
you.
I'm looking forward to it. I think I've seen
Yeah.
what you read. I think I've read that somewhere, and I was loving it, and I loved hearing it in your voice. So thank you very much for doing that.
Thank
That was
you.
neat.
Yeah. I think, you know what, the first chapter did appear on a kind of a limited preview that the HarperCollins did with a giveaway, and it'll be out and about in a bit. But and I should say the audiobook is being read by Marisa Callan, who did the audiobook for The Gown. And I asked if she could I thought she did such a lovely job with The Gown. So the audiobook will be out as well, and she will do a much better job. I'm sure of all the voices. She won't have that Canadian accent.
Nothing wrong with Canadian accent.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Jennifer.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
I learned so much. And I'm looking forward to it. So
thanks, Jen.
Thank you again. And we will do something in 2021 together, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, we have a great holiday. Well, you already did because we're going to play this in January. So I hope you have a great holiday.
Yay. You too. And to everyone out there.
Thank you very much.